Okay, I'm going to start over. This is our first time doing a Facebook Live, and I just got another message that I was unmuted and muted, so I'm going to start from the beginning. Welcome to our event today with Congressman Jamie Raskin, Constitutional Patriotism, Partisanship, and the Future of American Democracy. We have closed captioning at today's event, and you can turn it on or turn it off. It is live, so it's great by clicking on the CC at the bottom of your screen. The Council of Former Federal Executives and Associates, also known as COFFE, and Little Falls Village have partnered with Montgomery County Public Library's Little Falls branch to bring this event to you today as part of our speaker series. We have Margot Sussman here from the library, who is the head of adult services at the Little Falls Library. You can see the full list of speaker series on the Little Falls Village website and the Montgomery County Public Library website. We had over 2,600 attendees during 2020, and we're off to a great start in 2021. We are excited that this is the first speaker event that will use Facebook Live and will be recorded. So this really opens up a new avenue for us. So many people have been asking about the recording of our events, and this is our first step in that direction. The link to this recording will be on the Little Falls Village website, on the COFFE website, and on the Montgomery County Public Library website after the event. After Congressman Raskin's formal remarks, we will ask him a few questions that were submitted to us already. And if time permits, we will also open it up for people to be able to ask questions. And you will do that through the comments tab that is on the Facebook Live screen. While it is not necessary to have a Facebook account to participate in today's event, only the viewers who are logged into the Facebook account are able to submit questions or comments. Given the large audience at today's event, we may not be able to get to all the additional questions that are asked of Congressman Raskin. So if you have any further questions that you did not get an answer to, please submit those directly to Congressman Raskin's office, and we are going to put that address in the comment tab of your screen. Again, I want to apologize for the technical issues in the beginning, but we are going strong here. I will now turn it over to Ellen Wormser, who is president of COFFE, who will also introduce Congressman Raskin. Ellen?
Thank you, Lisa, and welcome everyone. Most of us remember the forceful closing arguments that Congressman Raskin delivered at the second impeachment hearing before the Senate. As the lead manager, he disputed President Trump's claim that the January 6th attack on the Capitol was nonviolent and peaceful, and in the tradition of American civil disobedience. There is no doubt Raskin had said this was the most serious presidential crime in American history. The third-term representative and constitutional law professor was at his rhetorical best. More than 700 people are so pleased to have him with us today. He's currently serving on multiple committees that I won't go into in the interest of time. Prior to his time in Congress, he was a three-term state senator in Maryland, where he served as the Senate Majority Whip. There, he brought about a ban on the sale of military-style assault weapons, and if I had to guess, he'll be supporting some kind of similar legislation in the House, following the slaughters in Georgia, Colorado, and elsewhere. Congressman Raskin has written several books, including the Washington Post bestsellers, Overruling Democracy, The Supreme Court versus the American People, and We the Students, Supreme Court Cases for and about America's Students. Not limited to scholarly pursuits, and probably something few people know, he and a colleague proposed a new Maryland state song to replace the existing one, which had been criticized for its racist and pro-Confederate lyrics. Congressman Raskin is a magna cum laude graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School, where he served as an editor of the Law Review. Congressman Raskin will need to leave by 2:20. So I happily turn the virtual podium over to you, Congressman Raskin. Welcome. You got to turn off your mute, on your mute.
Gotcha, Ellen. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you for such a warm welcome. Thanks to everybody part of the Council of Former Federal Executives and the Little Falls Village Council and the Little Falls Village Maryland Library and Montgomery County Libraries, everybody else who's part of this system. I'm delighted to be your guinea pig for your first Facebook Live event. I did not mind the technical difficulty because it gave me a chance to write my speech or to revise some of my remarks from before. I probably will not take a full 40 minutes to begin with because I'd like to save time for questions and dialogue with everybody who's joined us. I want to thank everybody out in the crowd of, what did you say, Ellen? 700 people or several hundred?
700.
700 people. Well, good day to all my friends. Unfortunately, I'm on my iPhone, so I can't see everybody. I wish I had my iPad and then I could catch everybody in gallery view,
anyway.
but I'll. Oh, I could not. Okay. Well, look, the title we've agreed upon is one of great moment and passion for me, because I think that the titanic struggle that we saw in the impeachment trial between constitutional democracy and violent insurrectionism and right-wing authoritarianism and fascism continues to be the framing struggle of our time. And this little speech has given me an opportunity to gather all of my thoughts about it and to declare what I think is at stake in this struggle and why all of us need to be invested in it. So let's start with constitutional patriotism, which I think is the quality that is so lacking in so many people in politics today. And so it's something that we clearly need to nurture and nourish within the civil society itself. And I'm going to tell you a story about a time I was invited to go on the O'Reilly Factor show. And this was before I was in politics, so I was still an innocent. I was just a law professor. And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals out in California had rendered a decision in the Newdow case. And Michael Newdow, if memory serves, was a doctor, a lawyer, and he was an atheist. He was a triple threat. And he brought a lawsuit because his daughter was in public school and they were leading the students in the Pledge of Allegiance. He wanted his daughter to participate, but he wanted to use the original Pledge of Allegiance, which had been written by a Baptist minister back in 1892, who wrote it this way: I pledge allegiance to my flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And so as it was originally written, there was no reference to under God. And it was in fact written as a very radical statement by a Baptist minister who was an abolitionist and wanted to stick it to the South because they continued to conduct display of the Confederate battle flag and people pledging allegiance to the Confederate battle flag. So he wanted to write this. It was the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the New World. It was 1892, but he wanted to write it as a way to promote love of the Union flag the flag that was carried by the Union soldiers, and that's what he did. So anyway, Michael Newdow said, my daughter, she doesn't want to opt out of pledging allegiance to the flag, a right that had been established in a case called West Virginia versus Barnett in 1943. But he said she wants to participate, but she doesn't want to participate with the one nation under God part of it, the part that was added in 1954. So he asked the court to strike down that passage that had been added in 1954. And amazingly, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with him and said, look, as a matter of constitutional interpretation, and this was, by the way, 2 Republican judges and 1 Democratic judge, but the 3-judge panel unanimously said that he was right, that this was an establishment of religion when Congress added the phrase, one nation under God. Okay. All of which is the backstory to my being invited on to go to the O'Reilly factor. He asked me to come on to explain why the Ninth Circuit was doing what it was doing, because I had written a book about the rights of students in public schools called We the Students. And so he wanted me to discuss the case. So naively, I said, sure, I'd love to go on, not realizing I was going to be the designated liberal whipping post for the day. And I went on the O'Reilly factor, and he said, well, can you explain why they're doing this? And I said, well, the Establishment Clause stands for the principle that government cannot endorse either a specific religion, like Unitarianism or Catholicism or Judaism, or nor can it endorse religion generally. And that includes just monotheism generally. And in fact, the Ninth Circuit had taken the 1954 Pledge of Allegiance through every conceivable Establishment Clause test there is, the coercion test, the endorsement test, the historical test, all of them. And all of them converged around the conclusion that it violated the Establishment Clause. And I reemphasize that this was not a partisan thing in any way. It was a Republican appointed judge who had written the opinion. It was a 3-judge panel and so on. Well, this did not make Mr. O'Reilly very happy. And he said, well, if we're not one nation under God, what are we? And I told him, well, you go back to the original, the Pledge of Allegiance as it was written. And especially if you're an originalist, he didn't like that. He said, we've done it this way since 1954. For 50 years, for a half century, it's been one nation under God. If we're not one nation under God, what are we? And I said, well, I don't know. How about one nation under Canada? At that point, that at least would be geographically correct if you can't handle it. But in truth, if you really need to be one nation under something and you don't like what the federal courts have ruled, one nation under the Constitution really captures the founders' vision of what we would be. Because we're not unified by virtue of being one religion, and there are no religious tests for public office in America. We're not unified by being one political party. We've got the First Amendment and freedom of speech and freedom of thought. We're not one political ideology, but we've got one Constitution. And it is under that constitutional framework, with all of the extraordinary values embodied in it, that we've all agreed to participate and live as citizens. The Supreme Court in that case ended up overturning the Ninth Circuit decision on the very dubious rationale that Mr. Newdow didn't have standing to bring a claim on behalf of his daughter because he and his daughter's mom were divorced and he only had custody every other weekend. So the court said that he didn't have the standing to assert his daughter's rights. And so the case was postponed for another day on the merits. But in any event, the episode reminds me that this is a tough thing for people to be constitutional patriots, to really elevate a belief in the principles of the Constitution over their own party's beliefs, over their own ideological beliefs, over their own religious convictions. It's very tough to do it, but that is the demand of living in a constitutional democracy. That was the test that was failed by 43 senators in the Senate when we brought over the case from the House of Representatives impeaching Donald Trump for inciting a violent insurrection against the Union, against the Congress, in order to overthrow the 2020 election and to continue his time in office, just contrary to the results in the Electoral College. Now, why do I say those senators failed the test? I say that they failed the test because, as Mitch McConnell himself conceded in the speech after the trial was over, we had overwhelmingly proven our case. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that Donald Trump was the one who had incited and indeed organized the mob to come to Washington. He invited the mob, he incited the mob, and then he ignited the mob and unleashed them on the Capitol. And then he continued to praise the mob, and even today is trying to whitewash and sanitize what happened last weekend. He gave an interview in which he said that the members of the mob, who actually were violently assaulting police officers and ended up producing the deaths of at least 5 people and hospitalized and wounded more than 140 Capitol police officers, in fact, had entered the Capitol, he said, giving hugs and kisses. So on the Senate side, the reason that I feel that there was a failure of constitutional patriotism is because there were 43 senators who clearly were not interested in the factual evidence in the case, nor were they interested in seriously examining the law of the case. They essentially had decided how they were going to vote as jurors before the trial began. Now, they swore an oath, first as senators, to preserve and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States and to defend it against all enemies, foreign and domestic. They also swore a separate oath as jurors in the impeachment trial, in which they swore that they would render impartial justice in the case. Both of those oaths of office, the general and the specific, are statements of constitutional patriotism. And yet there were numerous Republican senators who I saw with my own eyes who refused to look up at the video monitors when we played video footage of either former President Trump exhorting the crowds to show strength. You're not going to take your country back with weakness, and you're going to have to fight like hell or you won't have a country anymore. And the footage of police officers being assaulted and beaten up and speared with American flagpoles and Confederate flagpoles and sprayed in the face with mace and bear spray. They refused to watch the evidence. I could see them not taking in the evidence of the case. Against all of the evidence, which was overwhelming, there was no counter evidence introduced. Former President Trump refused to testify, despite us giving him the opportunity to come and testify. Ask yourself and anybody else around you today whether you would testify at a trial essentially accusing you of treason, accusing you of inciting a violent insurrection against your own government in order to overthrow an election and install yourself into office. I know if I were accused of that, I would be the first person there to testify to explain that it was nonsense, it was bogus, it was manufactured. And I have no doubt that everybody watching this today would also be there to testify in their own defense, because you'd have a defense. But here, there was no defense. There was no defense offered. And so we had a series of very phony constitutional arguments, which we proceeded to demolish one after the other. The First Amendment argument was ludicrous. We were not trying to arrest him and throw him into jail for his enthusiastic support for this mob and what he was saying about politics. He was being impeached for violating his oath of office when he incited a violent insurrection against the government. So like Justice Scalia said, you can't ride with the cops and side with the robbers. You can't ride with the cops and cheer for the robbers. At that point, you've sworn an oath of office, just like a cop has, just like the Capitol officers sworn to defend us that day who upheld their oaths. Donald Trump swore an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution and the laws of the country, and he violated that oath by inciting an insurrection against the Constitution, to tear down everything that was taking place because of the First Amendment and because of democracy and our election. He was trying to overthrow an election, and we know that that is true from the beginning. He tried to get specific state legislative leaders to nullify the popular vote and the Electoral College designation to the popular vote winner in several states, like to Biden in Pennsylvania, and to substitute instead an Electoral College designated and appointed by the state legislature. To their credit, the Republicans in Pennsylvania refused to do that. Then he moved to shake down individual election officials like Secretary of State Raffensperger in Georgia, who he said all he's looking for is 11,780 votes. Find me the votes. In other words, produce the votes, manufacture the votes, concoct the votes, commit voter fraud, commit election fraud is what Trump was doing. In other words, what he was accusing the rest of the country of, voter fraud, is what he was trying to perpetrate against the country. And he tried it against Raffensperger, a loyal Republican who had supported his campaign. And Raffensperger said, here, my family, we voted for him, we supported him, we gave him money, but he threw us under the bus. And they had all these death threats and threats of assassination and so on. The same way that Donald Trump, in the end, after none of those threats worked, decided he was going to mobilize the mob against his own vice president, which came and chanted, hang Mike Pence, traitor, traitor, traitor. And there was a traitor, but it wasn't Mike Pence. Mike Pence, he kept his oath of office on that day. He was loyal to the country. He refused to assert powers he didn't have, to negate the Electoral College votes coming in from Pennsylvania, coming in from Arizona, coming in from Georgia, and simply to say, oh, it's too confusing, we're going to reject those. Joe Biden doesn't have a majority anymore. Now we're going to kick it over to the contingent election in the House of Representatives, which was the president's plan. Why? Why would he want to kick it to the House of Representatives? Well, under the 12th Amendment, we vote there not by virtue of one member, one vote, but one state, one vote. And what do you know? The Republicans controlled 27 state delegations in the House of Representatives, and that would have been the way to victory. That's why he was hell-bent on driving Mike Pence to violate his constitutional oath and to pretend as if he could simply cast out the votes of millions and millions of people from Arizona and Georgia and Pennsylvania and other states. So it was 100% clear what had happened. And yet they wanted to say that we were somehow violating his First Amendment rights. He had the free speech right to say whatever he wanted, but he didn't have a right to incite a violent insurrection against the government. And then after the violence was unleashed, and he's being called even by members of his own party, like Mr. McCarthy, to say, you've got to help us, you got to call off the dogs. Trump says, it's Antifa. McCarthy says, no, it's not Antifa, Mr. President. It's your people, they're right here. To which the president says, well, maybe they just care more about the election than you do. And McCarthy responds, who the F do you think you're talking to? In other words, McCarthy has already been spending his time, his soul, going to work for the president to try to twist Pence's arm. And yet now suddenly all of us could be killed. As Lindsey Graham said, it was over. All of us could have died. Somebody could have had a bomb. More than 800 people entered the Capitol of the United States without going through a metal detector, many of them armed, many of them on hunting expeditions for the vice president, for Speaker Pelosi, and so on. But some of them hung their hat on free speech. Most of them hung their hat on the completely phony jurisdictional argument that the Senate could not conduct a trial of a president once he's left office. Even if he was impeached for things that he did while he was in office, and he was impeached while he was still in office. And he was impeached while he was still in office. He was impeached on January the 12th, 1 week, January 13th, 1 week after the violent insurrection took place. So we were able to demonstrate that this phony claim that the Senate couldn't be meeting for this purpose was totally wrong. It had happened in the first Congress. It happened in the famous Belknap decision after the Civil War, where the Senate spent not 2 hours, but 2 weeks debating that jurisdictional point, and then overwhelmingly concluded that the Senate had the power to impeach federal officers who had already left office. In fact, if you can't do that, that would mean you could save yourself for impeachment just by resigning, which was in fact what Belknap had tried to do. And the Senate said, you can't do that. So we completely demolished and refuted that argument. And yet still Mitch McConnell and 43 senators went back to hang their hats on that point. And despite the fact, by the way, that this is all a political question, which means that the courts couldn't review that judgment, it's completely up to the Senate itself. Why would the Senate, for the first time ever, define its powers in such a way as to preclude it from conducting a Senate impeachment trial of a president who was impeached in the House for crimes committed while he was in office and impeached also while he was in office? It just makes no sense. So, well, look, who did demonstrate constitutional patriotism? The people of the country did. Millions and millions of people who engaged seriously with the process, who are horrified by what the president had done. And I'm talking about not just Democrats, but independents, Republicans, Greens, other people not affiliated were absolutely scandalized and horrified by the president taking us to a completely new place in terms of the president aligning himself with domestic violent extremism. The white supremacists who have killed more people since 9/11 took place than any other terrorist group on earth. So after 9/11 took place, it has been domestic violent extremism, according to Donald Trump's own Secretary of Homeland Security, that has provided the major peril to public security in America. And we know that from what has been happening all over the country. We know that from what happened in El Paso. We know that from what happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue. We know that from what happened in Charleston, South Carolina, where Dylan Roof went in with an assault weapon and killed 9 African-American worshipers during Bible study. We know that from horrific attacks all over the country, and the president aligned himself with them. Again, not a surprise necessarily, but certainly a shock. Not a surprise because of what we saw in Charlottesville when the president declared that there were very fine people on both sides. Such a radical betrayal of American history and American values. When we saw fascists marching in Europe, we didn't suddenly squint real hard and say we could find very fine people on both sides. We went to defend democracy and human rights against the march of fascism and totalitarianism. Well, why this collapse of constitutional patriotism? Part of it, a big part of it, is partisanship. The idea that we owe our loyalty and our allegiance primarily to our political party. Now, I want to start off this part with 2 cheers for partisanship. Partisanship's not all bad. Sometimes people denounce all partisanship in all political parties, even while they live a completely partisan life. And I think that that is not a productive way of analyzing the issue. Okay, what's good about partisanship? Well, for one thing, partisanship reflects an exercise of First Amendment values. People can be partisans because they have the freedom of thought, the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, the freedom to get together and to organize for electoral purposes and other political purposes. That's good. One great way to get rid of Partisanship, to extinguish partisanship, is to impose a one-party authoritarian state. That's what the right-wingers all over the world want to do. They don't complain about partisanship in Saudi Arabia because they've just gotten rid of the other political parties. If you eliminate the political opposition, there's no partisanship. It all comes from the officially licensed state party. So in that sense, partisanship is a sign of vibrant multi-party competition, and the fact that the people who get state power are not allowed to use state power in order to eliminate the opposition and to squelch all alternative speech and dissenting points of view. Okay, so in that sense, partisanship is good. Partisanship is also good because in a free democratic society, it allows us to organize together, to articulate public agendas, to educate the public, and then to try to follow through on those agendas once we get elected. I've been very proud that Joe Biden has followed through on so many of the things that he's campaigned on in terms of infrastructure, in terms of confronting COVID-19 and crushing the virus with a real scientific mobilization, with a massive escalation of vaccination across the country. We campaigned on that, and he's been governing that way, just like he campaigned for HR 1 and defending and expanding voting rights. And now we're doing it. We passed that in the House of Representatives. We hope the Senate will move through. So there's another sense in which partisanship is a good thing. It helps to move politics forward. It helps to move government forward. But, okay, and here's the big but and why it's 2 cheers and not 3 cheers. Once we're elected, we've got to remember that our political party is just part of the whole. The word party comes from the French word parti, which means a part. Our party is just a part of the whole. We've got to try to govern in the interests of everybody, not just the people who got us elected. When I go out there and I'm fighting for voting rights, I'm not just fighting for voting rights for Democrats. I'm voting for everybody's voting rights, regardless of who you're going to vote for. When I go out there and I'm fighting for women's rights and women's equality and equal pay for women, I'm not fighting for equal pay for women who are in the Democratic Party. I'm fighting for equal pay for all women. When I'm fighting for environmental progress and to address climate change, it's not for just the survival of people who share my party platform. It's for everybody's. We've got to maintain that holistic outlook. Politicians know how to do this. Most politicians know how to do this, and I tell you why. Think about constituent work. You call my office and you say you got a problem with Social Security, medical care, Medicare, Medicaid, PPP. You're trying to get your VA benefits and you're having a problem. We don't say, are you a Democrat? Are you Republican? Are you an independent? Are you Reform Party or Libertarian? Agree? We don't care about any of that stuff. All we ask is, are you a resident of the 8th Congressional District? Because I'm only allowed to do constituent work for people who are in my district. We go to bat for everybody. We know how to be nonpartisan. And I hope, and I think this is part of constitutional patriotism, I hope that our partisanship extends to bipartisanship or tripartisanship or transpartisanship or suprapartisanship, getting beyond it and thinking in terms of the whole when it comes to fighting for the common good. Now, that doesn't mean that we're always going to agree as to what the public interest is or what the common good means, but at least we can debate the issue, what's good for everybody, not just what's good for my particular political party program. And I think that that kind of extreme partisanship, the kind you find in countries around the world, which has alas come to America, is a really dangerous thing. And in fact, it can lead a political party to become something much more like a religious cult, a cult of personality around one leader who essentially tells everybody else what to do. Belonging to a political party should not require you to suspend critical thinking skills and your ability to disagree and to dissent. After 10 of my colleagues in the House of Representatives voted to impeach Donald Trump for his clear high crimes and misdemeanors in inciting violent insurrection against the Union, there were all kinds of moves to censure them, to repudiate them, to remove Liz Cheney from her #3 role in the Republican caucus in the House as the chair of the House Republican Conference. This from a bunch of people who are trying to lecture the rest of the country about cancel culture. The first thing they did is that when these Republicans demonstrated critical thought and independent thinking skills, they tried to remove them from their party offices, repudiate and censure them back home. Talk about cancel culture. They invented cancel culture. You know, there's a case today involving Donald Trump that was actually thrown out by the Supreme Court because it's moot because he's no longer president, but where the president, then President Donald Trump, removed people from his Twitter accounts. He censured them or he canceled them out because he didn't want them on the account because of the things that he was saying. And then this guy turns around and says, I've got the right to tell Twitter and Facebook that they can't have rules against lying about the election or rules against hate speech or Holocaust revisionism or white supremacist speech. He wants to dictate to them what they're going to do on their platform. And then he wants to use his platform to try to cancel other people out. So this cancel culture, which is now embodied by the Republican Party, has led to a situation where nobody can question Donald Trump. It is a truly scary, authoritarian, cultish political environment within a political party. Now, the Democratic Party is not perfect. People attack us all the time because we're so disorganized, meaning everybody speaks his or her mind, and we debate and we fight and there's a contest. Yes, but we don't act like a religious cult. We don't kick people out or try to censure them or reprimand them because they don't follow what the dear leader says. And that kind of authoritarian politics, of course, carries over. It makes sense. Then President Trump aligned his foreign policy with every dictator and despot and tyrant and kleptocrat on earth, from Putin in Russia to Orban in Hungary to El-Sisi in Egypt to Duterte in the Philippines. You name it. You find an authoritarian despot, that was Donald Trump's best friend. So when we talk about, well, what's the future of American democracy? It's very tied up in this question of constitutional patriotism. Can we get people to be loyal and faithful to the whole Constitution, the values of the constitutional, not just our political parties? Can we make sure our political parties don't turn into authoritarian religious cults? And can we have America stand up for democracy, not just here, but all over the world? Democracy and human rights. That's gotta be the name of the game against the authoritarianism, the racism, the anti-Semitism, the fascism, the nativism, the immigration bashing, all of it, the immigrant bashing, all of it. We need to stand up for what's great in liberal democracy. We, the people, all of the people. Now, America didn't start out perfectly. I love to quote our last great Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, who spoke of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. We didn't start out that way. That's the beautiful, tantalizing Lincolnian ideal for what America should be. We didn't start off like that, but Jefferson and the other framers, say what you will about them, they at least put the values and the structures in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution to allow us to grow, to allow us to fight to become Lincoln's ideal of what a government should be. But we had to overthrow slavery to do it, and we needed the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments. We needed the Reconstruction Amendments. And if you look at what comes after it, the vast majority of the amendments are democratizing amendments that open America up to the people, all of the people, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, political party, and so on. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment gives us equal protection due process. The 15th Amendment says no race discrimination in voting. The 17th Amendment shifted the mode of election of US senators from the state legislatures to the people. The 19th Amendment doubled the electorate by giving us women's suffrage, inviting women into the democracy. 23rd Amendment gave our friends down the road in Washington, D.C., the right to participate in presidential elections. The 24th Amendment abolished poll taxes. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. You see, the real trajectory of American democracy is enlargement, expansion, inclusion, deepening of the values of democracy. That's the future of American democracy. Tocqueville said in Democracy in America that democracy and voting rights are either expanding, they're enlarging, they're growing, or they're shrinking, they're shriveling away. We come out of a period where there's been a tremendous assault on voting rights, an assault both by the government and also an assault from abroad by Vladimir Putin. So we are now in a period where we have to be expanding democracy rights and defending the right to vote. That's why we passed H.R. 1, which is mandating independent redistricting commissions in every state in the union to abolish gerrymandering. That is why it gives us a small donor public finance-based system for elections. That is why we are going to have automatic voter registration systems for all voters rather than this constant undertow of voter suppression and voter repression tactics that the GOP is trying to engineer. Today, the Republican Party across the country has introduced now more than 350 bills to try to restrict voting, to eliminate early voting, to restrict weekend voting, to get rid of voting on Sundays, to try to restrict or eliminate mail-in balloting, to make it far more difficult for people to cast absentee ballots, which of course is how Donald Trump and most of his cabinet voted. There's this tremendous assault taking place by a political party which, acting like a religious cult rather than a modern political party, has decided it's not going to try to figure out how to bring more people in and to compete fairly for votes. It instead is going to try to figure out how to eliminate voting rights for large parts of the population. It's going to figure out how to make it more difficult for people to exercise the franchise and to cast their ballots. That is also an act of constitutional unpatriotism. Before we even pledge that we want to try to get our party elected, we should say we want everybody to have the right to vote. And they flipped it over and said, no, they want their party to win so much, they're going to take other people's right to vote away. So I can now say, not just as a matter of partisanship, but as a matter of constitutional patriotism, that we've got to pass H.R. 1 to defend everybody's voting rights against these constant assaults and interruptions. The Constitution began with a number of imperfections, which were anti-democratic mechanisms. We've gotten rid of a lot of them, like the disenfranchisement of women and African Americans, the indirect selection of US senators, which we got rid of in 1913 with the 17th Amendment. We've dealt partly with the disenfranchisement of people in Washington in presidential elections, but not entirely, which is why our friends are demanding their statehood now, and rightfully so. But there are other structural problems that we need to address. The Electoral College has become a nightmare for America. It has given us two significant popular vote losers in the last 6 presidential elections, George W. Bush in 2000, Donald Trump in 2016. It sidelines and marginalizes millions and millions of Americans, the vast majority of Americans, who are not in so-called swing states. If you're not in Pennsylvania, if you're not in Michigan or Florida, a handful of other states, and you live in a safe red state like South Carolina or Alaska or Alabama, or a safe blue state like New York or California, Hawaii, nobody's coming out to ask for your vote. There's no real election in your states, and the election is basically a bygone conclusion in your state. Well, that's a ridiculous and arbitrary way to conduct a presidential election, where it comes down to 7 or 8 states who get to decide for everybody else. And no real presidential election is taking place. There are no TV ads, there's no campaigning, there's no offices set up. Those of us in Maryland know it well, us being a safe blue state. The very first bill that I introduced as a state senator in Annapolis, in Maryland, was for a national popular vote. And Maryland, much to our credit, became the first state to adopt the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which says we will cast our electors for the winner, not in Maryland, but for the winner of the nationwide vote, once we have enough other states join the coalition that were over 270 in the Electoral College. And so it becomes operative every single time. Well, that is now more than halfway there. I'm proud to say, I think we're at 196 electors, so we've got 74 more to go. Unfortunately, this too has become a partisan thing. It shouldn't be a partisan thing. Sometimes when I was campaigning for it in Annapolis, I found my biggest supporters were Republicans who said, yeah, we're totally bypassed in presidential elections. Nobody ever comes here. And it makes it very tough for the Republican Party to organize and get mobilized, because nobody can spend any time or set up any offices or organize. And I was one of the co-chairs of the Obama campaign back in 2008. And I remember we were told, if you get any volunteers, raise any money, you send it to Virginia. You spend your weekends going to Virginia, no signs for you, no events for you in Maryland. Why? Because it's in the bag. And that's the rational way of looking at it in this irrational system. So we need to deal with that problem. And we also need to deal with this problem in the Electoral College, which is that it is so rickety and creaky and obsolete that there are all these opportunities for strategic mischief and corruption. And we saw another one of them on January 6th, 2021, where what's supposed to be a completely pro forma process for ratifying the electors being submitted by the states became an opportunity for Donald Trump to try to intervene and to unleash this mob on his own vice president and on Congress in order to block the counting of electoral college votes. We can do a lot better than that. We can have a national popular vote where the people rule, and we elect presidents the same way we elect governors, we elect senators, we elect members of Congress. Whoever gets the most votes wins. That's it. So we got to deal with the Electoral College. We got to deal with the gerrymandering of our districts. The politicians should not be able to choose the voters before the voters choose the politicians. I'm proud that HR 1 puts this front and center. We need a nationwide solution to this problem. And HR 1 is the way to do it. Independent redistricting commissions. And I would advocate for multi-candidate districts, the kind that we have in Maryland with our three delegates. We could do that and arrive at fair districts. But in any event, you got to take the politicians out of the game of drawing their own districts. And this is one of our big fights with our party friends in the GOP. I told them right before we left for break, you're acting like GOP stands for gerrymandering over principles, because they say they got the principle that the voters should choose, but in fact, they are profiting so much from gerrymandering in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Ohio, in North Carolina, in Pennsylvania before their state Supreme Court overthrew it, that they figured that they're going to stick with it. That, again, is constitutionally unpatriotic. That is a departure from what constitutional democracy requires of us. So I think you get my drift there. Constitutional patriotism tells us that we need to keep democracy growing and expanding. That means statehood for our friends in Washington, statehood for our friends in Puerto Rico. We've got millions of people who've been left out, and statehood has been the mechanism for establishing people on a plane of political equality. We started with 13 states. We've added 37 states, which means that nearly 75% of our states were admitted later. Most of them have been admitted over the kinds of objections you hear about Puerto Rico and DC today. Puerto Rico, is too far away. Alaska and Hawaii were too far away. It's not contiguous. Well, Alaska and Hawaii were contiguous. DC used to be part of Maryland. Well, West Virginia used to be part of Virginia. Tennessee used to be part of Virginia. Kentucky used to be part of Virginia. Lots of states used to be part of other states. Right now, Congress controls it. It said, well, the federal district is frozen in time and place. No, it's not. Alexandria, Arlington, and Fairfax County used to be part of the federal district, and Congress in 1847 redrew the boundaries of the federal district at the behest of the slave masters. And if Congress can do that, certainly it can redraw the boundaries of the federal district in order to enfranchise and uplift 700,000 tax-paying, draftable US citizens in Washington. So let's keep democracy going. Let's keep democracy growing. Let's defend it against all the right-wing authoritarianism and the racism and anti-Semitism, which are a gateway to the destruction of democratic values and institutions. This is where we're headed. And maybe I will close for you by going back to my friend Tom Paine, remember, who wrote Common Sense, and he wrote The Crisis in 1776, because we're still in a crisis. You know, we had a vote to convict Donald Trump, 57-43. It was a majority, but it wasn't the super majority of 2/3 called for in the Constitution. So we're left in an ambiguous place. We have the constitutional fact established by the biggest bipartisan majorities in American history in the House and Senate, that the president incited violent insurrection. And yet we were unable to convict him and to bar him from ever holding federal office again under the 2/3 requirement. So he beat the constitutional spread, but we still assembled a very convincing bipartisan majority, the strongest bipartisan majority ever in American history in a presidential impeachment. There have been 4, as you know: Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, the first Trump, and the second Trump. And here we had the biggest bipartisan majorities ever. But we are in an ambiguous state, and we know that Donald Trump is out there not only trying to whitewash what happened on January 6th, but he is again trying to make himself the king and the lord of the Republican Party. Everybody's got to go through him. He's going to control all of the money, and he is rebuilding all of his control, consolidating his control, and rebuilding his alliance with these extremist right-wing groups. They have no enemies on the right wing in America, and he's trying to excuse and apologize for the violent assault on America that took place. He is saying that these people are being not prosecuted, but persecuted by the Department of Justice. In a rational world, he would be a political pariah, and he is increasingly a political pariah, but not in the Republican Party. So I call on the Republican Party, the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, the Democratic Party, every party to demonstrate constitutional patriotism, to put the values of the Constitution and of democracy first before our policy agendas, and certainly beyond our agendas for maintaining our own power and exercising our own control. I'll leave you the words of Thomas Paine. These are the times that try men and women's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will shrink at this moment from the service of their cause and their country. But everyone that stands with us now will win the love and the favor and the affection of every man and every woman for all time. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, but we have this saving consolation: the more difficult the struggle, the more glorious in the end will be our victory. That victory is going to be ours. There is no alternative. The issues are too big that we must confront. With climate change and with the economy and with public health, we must make democracy work for the people again. I yield back and am delighted to take questions.
Ellen, please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Congressman Raskin, thank you very much. Going back to the issue of terrorism, do you see the Congress taking action to better define what terrorism is and to create new laws making it a crime punishable in the courts?
That is a great question. You know, terrorism is the mobilization of violence and terror in order to advance a political program. There has been hesitation about defining domestic terrorism. Some people say, well, we have all the laws that we need to prosecute an event like January 6th or like the Oklahoma federal building bombing, the Murrah Center bombing. We don't need an extra domestic terror statute. I hope that's something that we will seriously analyze in this country and try to arrive at a solution. I am glad that the public is increasingly being told the truth that violent white nationalism is the most serious terror threat we face. It is more serious than ISIS. It is more serious than Al-Qaeda right now. It is a bigger threat to our safety and security. And we have to understand that in order to develop the law enforcement strategies that we need in order to counter the threat.
What do you see are the prospects for gun control legislation?
But thank you for asking that. And that's closely related to the question about terrorism and terror, because a lot of people are living under a reign of terror because of the plenitude of firearms in their communities. So we passed in the House HR 8 rather, which is the universal background check on violent criminals. This legislation is supported by, check it out, Ellen, more than 95% of the American people. It's supported by the vast majority of Democrats, vast majority of Republicans, vast majority of independents. Everyone says that nobody should be accessing a shotgun, a handgun, much less an assault weapon, without being able to pass a background check to make sure they're not a convicted violent felon or a fugitive or someone who has been found to be mentally irresponsible and deranged and therefore undeserving of being able to exercise this Second Amendment right. So it's overwhelmingly popular. It makes total common sense, and the GOP blockades it at every turn. The NRA exercises a stranglehold over the GOP. The National Rifle Association, which used to be a thoughtful, moderate, centrist, mainstream kind of organization, used to be completely open to rules and regulations for safe use of firearms and safe storage of firearms and safe training of firearms. Now, it exists as an adjunct to the right wing of the Republican Party. And their position is they will not support any legislation that would improve public safety, advance gun safety, because they think that all of it leads to confiscation of firearms, which is just paranoid and deranged. It just makes no sense at all. The Supreme Court has said people have a right to possess firearms for the purposes of self-defense and for the purposes of recreation. But the Supreme Court also said in the Heller decision that the government, the people, have a right to pass reasonable gun safety regulations to make sure that the wrong people don't get a hold of the guns, to make sure that there is safe storage, to make sure that guns are not being taken into public buildings and public schools and public libraries and so on. And yet the NRA drives this absolutist extremist hard line that prevents us from making the bipartisan common sense progress that America is calling for. So we passed HR 8. We are hopeful the Senate will be able to take it up, and we are hopeful that the Senate will be able to pass it. It's the same thing with ban on assault weapons, the kind that, the kind that was just used in Georgia, the kind that was used in Connecticut at Sandy Hook, the kind that was used in El Paso to kill dozens of Hispanic people down there, the kind that was used at the Tree of Life synagogue, the kind that was used in Charleston, South Carolina, and so on. You do not need a military-style assault weapon in order to go hunting, unless you're hunting for people. You don't need a military-style assault weapon in order to defend yourself. So we have had a ban on assault weapons before. We should go back to that. But let's start with the universal violent criminal background check. And I think that will be a critical test of whether or not the Republican Party is willing in a constitutionally patriotic way to stand up for the rights of people to be able to exercise the Second Amendment liberties in a responsible way, and also stand up for the public safety and the security of the community. These things do not have to be driven apart. We do not have to be polarized in this way, and we don't have to set public security against the rights of hunters and so on.
Okay, another question dealing with the filibuster. Mary Jo Deering has asked, eliminating the filibuster may sound like a good way to get the Democratic legislation through, but once the Democrats are no longer in the majority, Republicans will also be able to force their way through. So how can we accomplish the same goal without setting up something that allows such unilateral action to come back and bite us?
Well, let's start with this. We've seen a lot of unilateral action over the last 4 years. I mean, look at the right-wing court packing that's taken place. And it's a smart question because, look, we could be stymied on universal background check for violent criminals, HR 8. We could be stymied on our infrastructure plan. We could be stymied on HR 1. But think about HR 1. HR 1 is the key to the kingdom, right? HR 1 is democracy for the people. That gives people voting rights. HR 1 dismantles Republican gerrymandering around the country. HR 1 gives people fair access against the big corporate dark money. So we need to get HR 1 through, just like we need a universal criminal background check. We need to get that through. And if the Republicans are going to paralyze the country and prevent progress on everything, let's remember that the filibuster is not in the Constitution. It's really antithetical to constitutional values. Constitutional values are the Bill of Rights protect the civil rights and civil liberties of the people, but the majority gets to govern, not the supermajority, just the majority. And a majority in the Senate is already a supermajority. You know that Senate Democrats represent more than 40 million Americans than Senate Republicans, and there are 50 in each party. But the Democrats represent huge states with tens of millions of people, like New York and California. And the Republicans tend to represent or overrepresented in the small states, Montana and North Dakota and South Dakota and Nebraska and so on, not Illinois and Michigan. And so you've already got that disproportion. Okay, but that's built into the fabric of the Senate. You've already got, you know, if 50 Republican senators try to block 50 Democratic senators plus Vice President Harris, that's already 40 million fewer Americans blocking 40 million more. But then you go to the filibuster, and that says, this parliamentary tactic says you need 60 senators, not 51 senators, but 60 senators. Well, when you translate that, that means that a third of the American people can block what 2/3 of the American people want done in turn on protecting voting rights, on universal background check, you know, on equal rights and equal pay for women and so on. So essentially you're taking the disproportion, which is built into the Constitution for the Senate generally, and you're enlarging it, you're expanding it and making it much worse. So I wish there were a way we could do this without having to confront the filibuster. But I think that the other solutions have run out. I don't know that there is any other way to do this. Mitch McConnell's made clear that they will be a wrecking ball. They will do everything they can to stop democratic progress, small d democratic progress for the whole country. And it's true, they could end up having that power in the future, but put it this way, I would much rather have a situation where everybody could vote. We got rid of gerrymandering, and we had a meaningful campaign finance system, and we restore ethics to government, and then get the power back, and they try to undo that, than for us to be in a situation perpetually where we're never able to make those things happen because they exercise the tyranny of the filibuster.
Do you still have to leave at 12?
I'm not looking at my schedule. Let's just take it to 12:30, and my staff can beat me up later about it. Just if my staff is listening, please push everything 8 minutes away. I'd love to take some more questions
Okay.
because we had so many technical difficulties.
Looking at the postal service for a change of pace here, would you please address whether and when Congress can enact something that enables the U.S. Postal Service to recover from its destruction under the previous administration and from its financial situation that antedates even the past?
Well, thanks for that wonderful question. Louis DeJoy has been an absolute nightmare for the post office, and he's part of another partisan vendetta against the post office. They've done everything they can to destroy it, to make it dysfunctional, and they've done a good job at that. That's the only good job they've done, is succeeding in demobilizing the post office and demoralizing the workforce. Still, the post office remains one of the most popular institutions in America because people understand how the post office is built into the fabric of our country going back to the beginning. The post office is in the Constitution. I mean, Ben Franklin was our postmaster. The post office built the postal roads, which is why in most towns and cities, you've got a post road. The media, the newspapers, the press were built on the post office, which is why there's so many newspapers with names like the Washington Post and the Buffalo Courier Express and the Daily News and so on and so forth. The post office has enabled communications, transportation, and the integration of the country. The post office obviously needs to catch up to the 21st century and figure out how to integrate an 18th century technology, which was so much in the avant-garde then, with the internet and with email and so on. And there are growing pains there. But that's not the real problem today. The real problem has been what the question indicates, which is this internal war against the post office. There's a right-wing attack which wants to tear down everything public, whether it's the post office or public schools or public parks or national parks or whatever it is. It's antithetical to their ideology. They're against all government except that which relates to warfare and the military industrial complex and cops and prosecutors and so on. Other than the military carceral state, they're not interested in government being an instrument of the common good and the public interest. So it's very important for us to restore the post office, and we're going to try and do that. And I think we've got a lot of legislative efforts that you'll be hearing about soon to restore the post office. I'm glad that we just added 3 new governors to the board. I'm hoping we're going to be adding more governors to the board to change what's taking place in terms of the governance, to get away from this Trump effort to destroy the post office and to wreck its operations.
Do you see the Congress taking on the issue of the post office pension funds?
Yes, well, the particular law today requires the post office, unlike almost any other public or private entity in the country, to prepay people's pensions. And so I think they're up to 90 or 95% now. So that's extraordinary. I mean, that really explains why there's been such a financial pinch there. That in COVID-19 has been a nightmare for the post office. But I don't know what can be done about that at this point, but there are other things that we can do to restore the financial vibrancy and solvency of the post office. And we will be fighting for that program.
All right, another question on a different subject. What are your thoughts to moving to a system of nonpartisan primaries coupled with ranked choice voting?
Well, I am the lead sponsor of the ranked choice voting legislation in Congress, and I used to serve on the board of Fair Vote, which is the big electoral reform think tank, which is headquartered in Maryland's beautiful 8th Congressional District. So I am all for ranked choice voting. I am less familiar with moving to nonpartisan primaries, and I'm a little skeptical of that from a constitutional perspective, because the primaries are the point at which political parties themselves undergo internecine political competition and rivalry. And I think the competition is really good to let the parties sort it out, to come up with a nominee and a candidate to go up against the other parties. So I like the idea of my party allowing independents to come participate in my party. I think independents or nonpartisan people who haven't declared a party should be invited in. And I certainly am all for that. But I don't know about the idea of having other people in other parties pick the nominee of my party. That feels to me like kind of defeating the idea of having a political party in the first place. But I'm open to it. I haven't studied that issue and I've never written about it, but I promise you I will look into it once I get the time.
Why was Section 3 of the 14th Amendment prohibiting holding office for those who engaged in insurrection and rebellion against the Constitution not utilized in addition to or in place of your impeachment effort of the former president?
Well, there's a great question. We actually did use it. If you go back and look at my opening statement, you will see that I invoked Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which just reinforces the constitutional value that people who swear an oath to the Constitution and violate it should never have the opportunity to serve again. We did not want to confuse the issue in that that was not the specific legal question being brought to the Senate. The legal question was whether or not the president had committed high crimes and misdemeanors against the Republic in inciting violent insurrection. But I certainly articulated it at that point and a couple other points, I think, that this is a critical constitutional value. At this point, we might move separately on that pathway to do exactly what the questioner is suggesting. We think that this would block Donald Trump from serving again, as well as anybody else who participated in the insurrection. The Republicans have begun to say that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment just applies to the Civil War, but if you read it, nothing in it is limited to the Civil War. On the contrary, it's written in a generic way about participating in rebellion and insurrection generally. And that, in fact, was a narrowing of the original proposal. The original proposal said, if you participate in the Confederacy at all, regardless of who you are, you should never be able to serve in office or vote again. And when it got over to the Senate said, in passing the 14th Amendment, no, it shouldn't be anybody who participated in the Confederacy. It should just be those people who swore an oath to the Constitution and violated it. And it shouldn't disenfranchise them from voting, but it should keep them from ever holding office again. So that is the bullseye core for what Donald Trump did. He swore an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. He violated that oath by supporting this violent insurrection, and he should never be able to hold office again because of it. So thank you for raising that.
Well, it's 2:31, so I think we need to bring this to a close. Do you have any final words you'd like to say?
Well, I just want to thank everybody for your engagement, for your support, and for your active constitutional patriotism. I represent the greatest people in the world in Maryland's 8th District, and I'm glad I've got so many constituents on the line today. Thank you for being with me, and thank you for encouraging me and supporting every step along the way.
Thank you very much for being with us. We really appreciate your time at this.
Thank you, Ellen. All the best.
Okay. Bye-bye.